You may think you know what silence is, but I promise you, you have never met the kind that follows a man like a second shadow, the kind that judges him more harshly than any bishop could. It is that silence which shaped my childhood, and it is that same silence I am breaking now, though every muscle in my body tightens at the thought of doing so. My name is Aanshey, and I was born under the Ordnung as naturally as a calf is born under the open roof of a barn. Certain truths were woven into me from the first breath. Obey, submit, do not question, and above all, never reveal our ways to the outside world. Yet I find myself speaking to you now in a voice I barely recognize, because something in me has begun to fear that the world has forgotten what we remember, and that forgetting might cost more than our rules can hold back. I grew up in a valley carved by seasons rather than machines. The first sounds I knew were the thump of horse hooves against damp earth, the creak of wagon wheels, the rhythmic scrape of my father's draw knife smoothing a beam. I still remember the smell of the dawn barn air, heavy with hay dust and warm animal breath, so alive it almost hummed. And through all of it, I sensed the weight of the Ordnung even before I could speak its name. It lived in the way adults exchanged glances instead of words, in the careful folding of garments, in the precise angle of every lantern hung at dusk. It told us how to live, how to think, how to be. And for most of my youth I believed it was enough, that it was a cradle strong enough to withstand the world. But there were places where the Ordnung's light thinned, if only for a moment. I remember being 10 years old when my mother sent me to fetch water from the far pump. The path wound near the boundary road, our unspoken line of danger. I heard the mechanical roar of an English car before I saw it, a monstrous sound that turned my stomach yet stirred something else too, something sharp and bright that I dared not name. The car flew past, leaving behind a bitter metallic smell and a trail of dust that settled slowly on my sleeves. For the first time in my life, I looked at my own hands and wondered if there were things in the world beyond our fields that could make them into something different. I carried that thought like a sin for years. As I grew older, I learned to bury my questions the way we bury stones pulled from the soil, quietly, without ceremony. But questions have roots, and mine kept growing. I felt them most in the early mornings when I milked the cows alone. The world was always still then, the kind of stillness that presses against your eardrums, making even the softest sound feel forbidden. Yet every so often, on those mornings, I heard something that did not belong. A faint humming, distant, steady, unnatural. Not the churn of our butter machines or the whir of a buggy wheel. Something deeper, like a pulse beneath the earth. Each time, I forced myself to ignore it. The Ordnung teaches that curiosity is a door no one should open. But something changed the night before I turned 17. The wind came from the east, stirring the cornfields in uneasy patterns. I felt restless and slipped outside after evening prayers, barefoot so the boards would not betray me. The sky was cloudless, the stars sharp as needles, and the air smelled of distant rain, though the ground was dry. That humming sound returned, but louder now, unmistakably real, and close enough that I felt it in my ribs. I followed it without meaning to, as though my legs had chosen for me. It led me to the old creek bed, the one we rarely visited except during planting season. There the sound stopped, abruptly, as if swallowed. But something else remained. Footprints, not ours, larger, heavier, with edges too clean, like someone wearing boots made for stone, not soil, and near them, pressed into the mud, a long groove with parallel teeth. I crouched to touch it, and the cold of the metal impression prickled my fingertips even though no machine stood nearby. A chill passed through me, the kind that warns a man he has stepped into knowledge he wasn't meant to hold. I turned to leave, heart beating hard against my ribs, and froze. From the darkness of the tree line, I heard the unmistakable crack of a branch under someone's weight. Slow, deliberate, watching. I wasn't alone. I should have run. But when you grow up Amish, Fear teaches you stillness first, motion later. My father always said a man who moves too quickly reveals more about himself than a man who stays quiet. So I stayed quiet, though every instinct in me screamed to flee. The creek gurgled softly, the wind shifted through the high corn, and I heard it again, that deliberate step in the darkness, the kind that carries intention, not accident. I stood slowly, forcing my breath into steady rhythm the way our bishop had taught during moments of spiritual unease. It did nothing to calm me. A shape emerged between the trees, not large, not monstrous, but wrong enough that my heart kicked painfully against my ribs. Wrong coat, wrong stance, wrong gaze. He was English. That much I knew at once. No Amish man stands with his shoulders squared like that, as if expecting the world to bow or strike. No Amish eyes sweep the ground the way his did, scanning, measuring, cataloging details, as if every blade of grass held a secret. And certainly, no Amish man would be out here at this hour without lantern or task or permission. He stepped into the moonlight, and his boots, black, smooth, industrial, looked foreign in our mud. "Evening," he said, his voice controlled, too steady for a man who claimed no business here. He didn't ask my name. That was the first thing that unsettled me. Outsiders always ask our names, as if knowing them is some kind of entry ticket. But he watched me with the tense focus of someone who already knew exactly what he was looking at. I answered him only because my silence felt riskier than my voice. "Evening." The words scraped out of me, dry as straw. If anyone from my district saw me speaking with an Englishman, there would be questions, perhaps even confession before the ministers. But the alternative, to remain alone with him in silence, felt worse. "You live close?" he asked, though he must have known the answer. No one else lived within 3 miles of this creek besides us. "Close enough," I said. He nodded once, slowly, the kind of nod that doesn't acknowledge an answer but weighs it. Then he crouched where I had been, examining the marks in the mud. His fingers hovered a moment above the machine groove, careful not to touch, as if it were dangerous or sacred. "You see this?" he murmured. I regretted instantly kneeling there earlier, regretted touching the impression, regretted wondering. Curiosity is a trap in our world, but this man's curiosity felt like something sharper. "I saw it," I admitted. His jaw tightened just slightly, like he'd expected me to lie. "How long has it been here?" "I don't know," I said truthfully, though part of me sensed it was no more than hours old. He glanced at the trees as if listening, really listening, with a tension that made the hairs rise on my arms. "Has anyone from your community mentioned unusual sights? Lights? Strange noises?" My blood ran cold. The humming sound from nights before throbbed again in my memory. The Ordnung didn't forbid hearing things, but it forbade acknowledging them if they contradicted our peace. A man who talked too freely risked discipline, suspicion, or worse, the erosion of trust. "I haven't heard anything," I said, though I'm not sure he believed me. He rose slowly, brushing mud from his gloves. His final look at the tracks was not curiosity. It was dread masked by calculation. Then he forced a smile, the kind that tries to fit onto a face unaccustomed to wearing one. "You should head home. Nights can be unpredictable." He said it gently, but it landed like a warning. He turned and walked away without another word. But he didn't leave the way he'd come. He cut deeper into the trees, toward the heart of our land, not away from it. And that was when a thought struck me, not a childish fear, not an imaginative leap, but a cold, sobering truth that pulled tightly around my chest. He hadn't stumbled upon those tracks. He had been searching for them, expecting them, following them. When the darkness swallowed him, I felt the valley shift around me, as if a long-settled layer of our world had been disturbed. I looked again at the machine groove in the mud, then at the boot prints leading into the woods, and that's when I realized something I wish I hadn't. There were 2 sets of boot prints going into the trees. but only one man walked away. I barely slept that night, though I lay in my bed long enough for the lantern flame to shrink and the house to settle into the familiar rhythm of nocturnal sounds. Normally, the creaking beams above my room comforted me, reminding me of the countless nights I'd drifted to sleep under the Ordnung's quiet roof. But that night, the wood sounded tense, strained, as if it sensed my unrest. Each whisper of wind against the shutters made my heart jolt. My mind replayed the image of two boot prints leading into the woods and only one man walking away. Fear isn't something we speak of. In our community, fear is treated like a weed, something you pull before anyone notices. But lying there in the darkness, I felt fear sink deep roots. By morning, I forced myself back into routine. Routine is the scaffolding of our life, the structure that keeps loose thoughts from drifting where they shouldn't. I fed the horses, carried grain to the chickens, and milked the cows. Every chore done as it had been done by my father, and his father before him. But the moment I stepped outside, I sensed it. The valley felt heavier, as if the air itself held its breath. Even the cows seemed uneasy, shifting their weight more than usual, flicking their tails not at flies but at some invisible disturbance. I moved through my tasks faster than I should have, trying to calm myself, reminding myself that last night could have been a misunderstanding, but then I heard it again. That humming. Except this time it wasn't distant or faint. It vibrated through the soil beneath my boots, a low subterranean tremor that pulsed slowly like a heartbeat buried far beneath the fields. No sound in our valley behaves like that. Wind rustles, water murmurs, insects hum. But this was something deliberate, something mechanical trying to mimic the rhythm of the earth. I stood completely still, watching my breath fog in the morning chill, even though the air wasn't cold enough for that. The humming stopped abruptly the moment I focused on it, leaving behind a ringing silence that made the hair on my arms stand upright. It felt almost intelligent, as if it had retreated when it realized I was listening. I tried to shake it off, but the memory of the man in the woods returned like a hand gripping my shoulder. I found myself glancing toward the tree line again and again, half expecting to see his face, or worse, someone else's. That's the trouble with curiosity. It never leaves a man in peace. Once awakened, it whispers through every quiet moment, urging him toward places he has no right to tread. And yet I knew that if I said a word of any of this to the elders, they would rebuke me for letting my imagination stray. They would urge prayer, humility, a tightening of the mind, so that thoughts stop leaking into forbidden corners. When Father joined me near the barn, he watched me longer than he usually did. Amish fathers are not men of many words, but they know their sons the way they know their tools. Any slight change is noticed. He didn't ask what troubled me. He simply said, "Your mind is loud today." It was the closest thing to concern I'd heard from him in months. I wanted to tell him everything. I wanted to confess the prince, the stranger, the humming that felt like a warning pulsing through the soil. But I could already hear his response in my head. The Ordnung protects us from what we are not meant to know. Trust in the Ordnung. Trust in God. Trust in the silence. So I said nothing. I lied by omission, the most common lie in our world. At midday, while working near the far fields, I found something else, something that made my stomach twist. A patch of corn had been flattened, not in the untidy, uneven way wind scatters crops, but in a perfect oval. The stalks were pressed down in one direction, smooth, clean, as if brushed by the arm of a giant tool. I knelt, touched the soil, and felt it, warm. Too warm for the mild day. As if something had been sitting there, something heavy, radiating heat. That was the moment the truth finally forced itself through my denial. Whatever had left that impression by the creek hadn't been small or simple. It was large, it was metallic, and it was close. I rose quickly, eyes darting toward the woods, heart thudding in my chest. I tried to calm myself, to breathe through the fear, but the valley no longer felt like home. It felt observed. And then, far off near the ridge, I saw movement. Not the sway of branches or the shifting of wind. Something upright, tall, dark, watching me with the stillness of a predator that knows it has already been seen. The figure on the ridge remained so still that at first I wondered if my eyes were deceiving me, if the tension of the past days had finally twisted ordinary shadows into threats. But shadows do not hold their shape so firmly. Shadows do not square their shoulders. Shadows do not watch. I stood frozen between rows of corn, the stalks rustling around me as if urging me to run, to hide, to pretend I had seen nothing. But I could not look away. The figure did not move closer, nor did it turn away. It seemed to be measuring me, weighing something silently, the way a hawk assesses the field from the sky. I blinked once, and it was gone, swallowed by the tree line without even disturbing the leaves. My hands trembled as I wiped the dust from my palms, but I forced myself to walk back toward the house at the pace of a man with nothing unusual on his mind. A man whose world remained in order. But the Ordnung could not shield me from the unease blooming inside. At supper, when we gathered around the long wooden table, I could barely taste the food. My father bowed his head in the calm manner of a man who expects life to remain entirely within the lines set for it. My mother moved with her usual gentle precision, passing bread and broth as if the world beyond our valley did not exist. My younger sisters whispered to each other about sewing lessons and a new litter of kittens in the barn. Everything looked exactly as it always had, but the familiarity felt like a film stretched tight over something else entirely, something I could sense pressing from beneath. I ate in silence, though silence had begun to feel like its own form of dishonesty. Every time I shifted in my chair, I imagined the figure on the ridge stepping closer. I imagined the Englishman from the creek crouching in our fields under the cover of night. I imagined that humming sound stirring again beneath the soil. It was impossible to tell if these fears were childish or prophetic. Our community deliberately keeps us shielded from the logic of the outside world, but sometimes ignorance itself becomes a kind of darkness in which anything can hide. After supper, as the lanterns dimmed and the evening chores began, I made an excuse to go to the far shed. It was farther from the main house than necessary, but I needed to think without eyes on me. I walked slowly, waiting for the chirp of crickets to settle into their usual nighttime rhythm. Yet even the insects sounded off. Their cadence felt uneven, broken by faint pauses that made my skin prickle. The valley's natural chorus rarely faltered. It had been my lullaby since infancy. Now it sounded like a song interrupted by an unseen conductor. Inside the shed, the familiar scents of oil and wood should have calmed me, but instead they sharpened my sense of unease. Tools hung in their exact places, untouched. The workbench was clean. Nothing here explained the tracks, the heat-pressed oval, the figure on the ridge. I sat on a wooden crate and rubbed my thumb along a groove in my palm. I needed to choose. Tell someone or remain silent. But who would believe me? Who would even allow the conversation to continue once I mentioned an Englishman at the boundary? Speaking openly could be seen as the first step toward wandering thoughts. Wandering thoughts lead to wandering feet. Wandering feet lead to excommunication. The Ordnung fears the first small step more than the fall itself. Yet silence felt like treason against my own mind. For the first time, I understood why some boys during Rumspringa glimpsed the outside world and never returned. It wasn't the electricity or the cars or the clothing. It was the unbearable contrast between two ways of living, one that demands total obedience and one that allows a man to question. I didn't want to leave. I didn't want a different life. I only wanted to understand the shadow that had entered mine. A sudden knock on the shed wall made me flinch so sharply that I nearly toppled off the crate. It was not the quick tapping of a bird or the scraping of branches. It was a deliberate knock, 3 slow, evenly spaced strikes. Cold rippled through me. No one knocks on shed walls. They call out your name or they approach from the front. But this felt like someone testing the boundary between inside and out. I stood without making a sound, my heart pounding in my throat. The lantern on the shelf flickered as if responding to a draft, though the air was still. The knock came again, softer this time, almost curious. I swallowed hard and took one step toward the wall. The wood felt warm under my palm, and then, from the other side, a voice whispered my name. I froze with my hand still pressed to the wooden slats, the night air thickening around me as though the valley itself had stopped breathing. No one in my family would whisper my name like that. No neighbor would speak through a wall without announcing themselves, and certainly no outsider should know my name at all. It felt as if the sound had slipped between the boards like smoke, soft enough to be mistaken for imagination, but heavy enough to anchor me in place. I waited for the voice to call again, but the silence that followed was so absolute it made my ears ring. Slowly, I stepped back from the wall, feeling the weight of the shed grow around me, turning familiar corners into a cage. I told myself not to panic, not to let my thoughts run. But fear is a fast creature. Once it gets loose, it knows every path a man's mind tries to hide. I took a long breath, then another, forcing myself to push open the shed door and step outside. The night met me with an unnatural stillness. No wind shifted the trees, no insects hummed. Even the distant horses in the barn were quiet. The lantern in my hand cast a narrow circle of light, barely strong enough to carve away the darkness ahead. I scanned the field, expecting a figure, expecting movement, anything that could explain the whisper. Nothing. Only the cold sweep of an empty yard. I walked slowly around the shed, lantern raised, feeling the earth crunch beneath my boots. My breath puffed visibly in front of me, even though the night wasn't cold enough for that. Every few steps I stopped to listen, leaning into the silence the way a hunter listens for prey. But the only thing I heard was the uneasy thud of my heart. When I reached the back wall, I crouched and ran my fingers along the wood. It was still warm. I pulled my hand away sharply. It shouldn't have been warm. The shed absorbed the evening chill faster than the house, yet it pulsed with residual heat as though something, or someone, had pressed against it moments before. A flicker of movement caught my eye near the tree line. I stiffened, lantern trembling in my grip. It was faint, almost nothing, just the suggestion of a shape shifting between two trunks. When I focused on it, the darkness swallowed it whole. I felt watched. Not in the way a curious outsider watches us during errands in town. No, this was different. This was the watchfulness of something that understood boundaries and had chosen to ignore them. The figure from the ridge, perhaps. Or the Englishman, or something else entirely, something that had left the machine grooves and the flattened oval in the fields. I returned to the house without allowing myself to run, though my legs begged me to. When I stepped inside, the warmth of the lamps and the familiar scent of wood smoke should have eased me. Instead, they made my skin crawl. I half expected to find the stranger sitting at our table waiting for me. But the kitchen was empty, the chairs pushed neatly in, my mother's apron folded on its hook. Everyone had gone to bed. The house felt untouched by the night's disturbance, as if the danger outside stopped politely at our doorframe. I crept to my room, listening for any sign that the whispering voice had followed me. Nothing moved in the hallway. Nothing breathed except me. When I finally lay down, sleep refused to come. Hours passed. Long, aching hours in which my thoughts became louder than any sound the valley could produce. I kept replaying the whisper, the warmth of the wall, the shadow on the ridge. None of it fit into the Ordnung's understanding of the world. Our way of life requires the universe to be simple, to follow patterns as steady as the rise of the sun. But something had entered our valley that did not respect patterns, that did not recognize boundaries drawn by men in plain clothes. Near the darkest hour of the night, I heard it again. The humming, not from the ground this time, but from above. I sat up sharply, nearly knocking over the lantern beside my bed. The hum vibrated through the roof beams, low and steady, like the distant spinning of enormous wheels. No machine we use produces a sound like that. No machine we forbid could approach so quietly. It built slowly, a pressure in the air, a trembling in my bones. I held my breath as the sound thickened, deepened, hovered, and then, impossibly, a soft glow spread across the ceiling, an illumination without source, diffuse and shifting like the reflection of light on water. I stared upward, pulse hammering, as the light contracted, dimmed, and vanished. The humming faded with it until the night felt smotheringly silent again. But the silence didn't last. From outside, close to my window, I heard footsteps. Slow, heavy. And then a low, careful voice, not quite whispering, not quite speaking, saying words I did not understand. Then it said my name again. I knew the moment I stepped out into the night that something in me had already crossed a line I could never return from. The air felt unnaturally still, almost expectant, as if the whole world was holding a lantern to my face, trying to read the truth I had tried so long to keep buried. The fields lay dark and silent, but it wasn't the silence of peace, it was the silence of something watching, something patient. I walked anyway, because I needed distance, needed breathing room to understand what I had done by speaking to an outsider. The Ordnung teaches us that words have weight, and when they fall outside the circle that forged them, they can become tools, or weapons, or warnings. I wasn't sure which I had just created. The path between the corn rows felt narrower than it had in childhood, as if the stalks leaned inward, whispering against one another, telling their long green secrets. Every crunch beneath my boots made me flinch, because in my mind echoed every lesson, every warning. The world beyond does not need to know us. We survive because we remain unseen. And now I had done the unforgivable. I had let someone see, not through our windows, but through me, through the crack that had been forming since I first wondered what the stars look like from a place with no restrictions on where a man may stand. Halfway through the field, I heard the distinct sound of another pair of footsteps, slow, deliberate, heavy. At that hour, no Amish man should have been wandering. Night is for rest or prayer, not for wandering through shadowed fields. I wanted to believe it was one of the boys returning from late chores, but something in the rhythm of the steps told me otherwise. Whoever followed me walked with purpose. When he stepped into a band of moonlight, I froze. It was Elder Matthias. His face was half lost in the dark, but his presence alone told me he had not come for a friendly word or a shared prayer. Matthias did not leave his house at night unless something had already gone terribly wrong. He approached without hesitation, the hem of his coat brushing the corn leaves, making them hiss like serpents. I stood still, unable to find words, while he stopped just a few steps away, his eyes fixed on me with the kind of calm that feels more threatening than anger. "Aanshey," he said quietly, and my stomach tightened. He rarely used my full name. It meant he was speaking not as a neighbor or elder, but as a keeper of Ordnung, as a guardian of silence. I felt the urge to defend myself, to explain, but no explanation could hide the truth. I had talked. He could feel it in the way a man senses a shift in the wind before a storm. The truth clung to me like the damp earth on my boots. "There are things we do not speak," he continued, his voice barely above a whisper. "There are memories meant to remain in the circle, not because the circle is afraid, but because the world outside has forgotten why such memories matter." His words should have comforted me, but instead they opened a deeper darkness inside my chest. I had always believed our secrecy was about protection, for us, not for the world. But the way he said forgotten made it sound as if the forgetting itself was dangerous. I asked him what he meant, but he shook his head. "If you open certain doors with your words," he said, "you cannot choose what steps through." His hand twitched at his side, as if fighting the urge to place it on my shoulder. But then he froze. His eyes shifted past me toward the tree line at the edge of the fields. Something moved there. A shape, too tall to be an animal, too still to be a man. The hair on my arms rose. I turned instinctively, but Matthias grabbed my wrist with surprising strength. "Do not look," he hissed. "If you look directly, the path back closes. For you. For all of us." But fear, curiosity, and some darker instinct twisted together inside me. I could feel the weight of something in the trees, something that had been there longer than our farms, longer than our Ordnung, maybe longer than our oldest stories. My heart pounded, my breath shortened. I felt the pull of the unseen, the same pull that had driven me to speak to an outsider. And I turned. I saw it. Not clearly, more like seeing the shape of a nightmare just before waking, but enough to know it was real, enough to know it had been waiting. Matthias exhaled sharply, not in relief, but in resignation. "You have seen," he said. "Then everything changes now." He released my wrist, and behind us, in the darkness, the shape took a single step toward the light.